Want to give a quick shout out to all my patrons. Thank you so much for the continued support. And I am done. Okay, so I just finished up listening to Legend by David Gemmell. This is the first book in the Drenai Saga, and I want to give you my unedited thoughts upon finishing this book, which was just right now. So I really like this book. I'm going to end up giving it a 4 out of 5. Maybe like a little closer to like the 4.5 range, because I really did like this, but it's not quite there. I mean, it's got its faults, namely maybe some of my own biases against some older books and the way that they're structured, but this is a fun tale and one that I was really, really looking forward to reading. I've been looking forward to it because, honestly, more than any other book out there, I can't think of another one that I've had recommended to me more than I've had this one. And I don't know if it's because the book is so popular. I think it was really popular in the 80s and maybe even the 90s, but I don't hear about it as much now. But I think the bigger reason is because a lot of people look at what kind of videos and what kind of things that I put out there, and they say, look, if you like that, then you're going to love this. So my expectations were pretty sky high. And because of my expectations, this did let me down a little bit. I think that I predicted at the beginning of the month that I would end up giving this a 5 out of 5. And I just wasn't quite there. So if you're not familiar with what this story is all about, this is a story essentially about one siege. And the siege itself is not really the crux of the story. It's a lot about the setup and the preparation for a siege. And I like that kind of stuff. I mean, I am a history fan. I've read a lot of historical books. I've read a lot of historical fictions. And usually when sieges are involved, for some reason, that really appeals to me. I love this idea, especially on the defending side. And I've read a lot of good books that involve this. Most recently, the 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City that I loved. And before that, one of the Black Company books is like almost entirely about that concept as well. So especially like the fantasy books that I've read in this, they've worked really well. This one had its faults, namely in the character side, and I'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, plot-wise, this is about a siege, and it's bigger than that. It's like this larger scale conflict that's going on, where you've got this one country who's trying to invade, and really their first kind of launching off point in trying to get into the central heart of this other country is to go through this one castle that they kind of need to get through. And bigger than that, there's this hero of this story. He is Druss the Legend, and that's where this title of the story comes from, Legend. And this is somebody who is like the greatest hero of this country's history, who's never lost a battle, but he's older now. He's in his 60s, which even now is older for somebody fighting in a battle, but you get the sense that this guy is like geriatric in this story. But they've brought him back, and he is going to lead this fight, even though he is very old. And everybody has like these mixed feelings about this because, one, he's never lost, but two, he's rather old. But he's back, and he's trying to lead them to victory. And I love this concept also of these older heroes. And maybe it's because I'm getting a little bit older myself. I am on the other side of my life. I'm getting closer to 60 than I was, being born, certainly. And so I like this concept, these stories that oftentimes appeal to me, like Kings of the Wild, that have this, one more last get together of some older hero that's going to try to save the day. And I really like that aspect of the book. But Druss is not the main character here. This is split up between multiple POVs. He does get a decent amount of time here, but this is split up between others as well. Others that are either there or on their way to this conflict that have their own things going on. And I think ultimately would have liked the story more if it had more Druss in it. But yeah, it's fun. I also liked this concept that you felt like this is a world that is living and breathing for a number of reasons. You've got this huge conflict that's going on that you're just dropped right into the middle of. It's not the beginning of this conflict. You're introduced to this hero as he's older. You get this, you hear about all these battles and things that I kind of want to read about. And I'm hoping, I know that the Drenai Saga is very long, well over 10 books. I think it's closer to 20, maybe even more than that. But I think it's like closer to 20 than 10. And so I don't know if these are chronological or if they go back in time to tell me some more Druss history here that I'd be super into hearing about. But I love this sense that that I'm sitting here thinking about the other history of this world. That's when you know that the world building is done right. And it really was one of the high points of this story. So loved that, loved everything involving Druss. But some of these other characters I didn't love as much. Pretty much all of the characters besides Druss I thought were not as fleshed out as they could have been. And I often see this, and I don't want to seem like some elitist for like modern fantasy stories, but I find often that I'm not super in love with the characters back in these 80s fantasy books, and this is another in line with that. They're more plot heavy, they're more into this world building than they are in the characters. And maybe some people are out there watching this being like, Matt, you have that totally backwards. I love the characters from those 80s books. I don't know about the worlds, but that's my take on it. So yeah, the characters were a little weak. World awesome. The plot here was very good. It's not a very intricate plot. I mean, I basically just spelled out the plot for you, but I didn't ruin, what happens in the siege. Now, what happens in the siege is highly entertaining. The ending is not something that I would have guessed. I wouldn't say it's like super, twisty, but it's just not something that, if you told me, Matt, there's a siege going on, here's the background, what do you think happens? I wouldn't have got it right. And I like that. I don't like knowing what's going to happen in my stories usually. Sometimes it works when you kind of get this framing narrative, but here, I really liked what happened. And I actually found myself liking the book more and more as this book went along. I really liked the last 100 pages or so. Especially there's this moment that happens between the two leaders as they're communicating and going over things. And I love every time the leader of the other war band is involved here. It's awesome stuff. I love this idea, and there's a lot of historical relevance for this, of two enemies that don't really hate each other. They respect each other. They just are told to go to fight, and they have to do their duty. And it's not like they're sad about it, but they also have high respect on both sides. And I love that. I've always loved that in history, and I certainly love it in my fantasy books. The fantasy elements here are extremely light. I mean, it almost reads like a historical fiction. In fact, I've read historical fictions that kind of almost have more fantasy elements than this one does, because the only fantasy elements here are kind of like a shaman type of character that can kind of, see the future a little bit, see versions of the future, and do some light communicating to other shamans across far distances. That's basically it. Now, there is a little twist here that I want to ruin for you, but it's not like this is not really a major fantasy book, and by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I did like the elements that were in it, but yeah, I'm not going to sit here and be like, yeah, I love all the fantasy parts of this, because they're not really there. I mean, clearly it's a fantasy book because it's a made-up world, right? When you have made-up worlds, that's a fantasy book. You don't have to have any magic in a book to make it a fantasy book. Now, that happens to be almost all of the time it does, but yeah, this is not a real world. This is not Earth. This is all made up, and so yeah, fantasy, through and through. But yeah, I liked that aspect of it, but not in love with it. The writing style itself is definitely dated. Now, that's not a bad thing, but when you're reading this book, it feels like a book that's kind of pulled out of the 80s. It's got that same kind of structure that you would normally see. Nothing that's really going to blow my mind here. The prose is not incredible. And yeah, but it's good. It's certainly passable. Now, I listened to the audiobook version of this. I thought the audiobook narrator was quite good. In fact, this is a book that I would recommend on audio in a number of reasons. One, the audiobook narrator is really good. You have to have that. But two, this is not very complicated. There's not a ton of name characters. It's easy to follow along. And I don't know about you, but for me, I can get really lost in fantasy books in audiobook if they're really complicated. When you look at a book like Malazan, there's no way I'd be able to follow that. But even, half as complicated that, or a quarter as complicated that, I can't follow. I have to make them easier with a small list of characters for me to have any hope of getting enjoyment out of my fantasy audiobooks. Now, I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but if you want to listen to this in audiobook and you do not have an Audible account, check out audibletrial.com/Matt, or just hit the link down below in the description and sign up for a free trial. You'll get a free book or two if you're a Prime member, and that helps me out. I get money when people sign up for a free trial. You don't even have to sign up after that. Just the mere fact that you're signing up for a free trial really helps me out, and it's a major source of income for this channel. So if you don't have that already, or you have a family member that doesn't have an Audible account, you would certainly be doing me a solid by signing up or getting them to sign up. So I will end my shameless promotion there and move on to my overall enjoyment of the story. It's good. It certainly was enjoyable enough for me to want to continue this story. Now, I'm not going to be like, man, I can't wait to read the next one. I'm going to move it way up my TBR. No. Will I read this again? Yes, I'll read in a couple months. I'll read the next one, and if I like that, I'll keep going. Hopefully, I'm going to like this story more and more as it goes along. Now, I fear that's not going to happen because I don't hear people talking about the other books in this series. I don't ever hear that. I don't ever hear what I hear oftentimes in fantasy, and people saying, yeah, the first one's good, but the second one's amazing. Haven't heard that at all. Now, maybe I'm contrary. I do find that I have a lot of contrary fantasy opinions. So hopefully this is one of them. And I'm going to say, yeah, Legend, it's good, but really you got to check out the number 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 books, because that's where it gets good. So hopefully I am in that boat. I will try it and report back on my thoughts on that. So I am going to finish this review there. Thank you so much for watching this review. And as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier patrons, Anna, Ben, Brian, CJ, Donut, Darren, Jamie, Maria, Michael Sugarman, My Book is Lit, Nev's Book Channel, Romeo Mike, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L., and Sky.